Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Today, we're continuing on with our interviews with the candidates who are running for Treasurer of the Law Society. The benchers will be electing their new treasurer over the next week, and I think the results will be available on June the 17th. And we are now joined by one of the candidates, Shalini. So, Shalini, thank you so much for joining me here today, and perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I grew up in Toronto, Scarborough specifically, and then for my legal career, I was called in 2000. And since then, really, I've been in the legal aid sort of apparatus. So I started my career not actually in the Greater Toronto area. I started it somewhere called Renfrew County, which is just about sort of northeast of Ottawa. And I spent some time working there before coming back into the city and working at the clinic in Mississauga. And then I took over as being the executive director of the South Asian Legal Clinic at its inception. And that clinic actually has a province-wide mandate. So now for the past about 17 years, I've gotten to work sort of around the province. And when I was articling, I articled in Chatham. So it's been a really interesting thing kind of working around sort of Ontario these past 26 years now. And so I work in a number of areas of law. I run a small firm-like setting that I help to create and start. So I manage employees, I manage all of the financial pieces. I just finished our audit today. We do our risk management, but I also practice. And I think what's really interesting for me is that I practice in the law with clients. I probably worked with maybe thousands of clients in those 26 years, but I also get to take that practice and turn it around into what we call law reform, which is doing work with governments like government relations, doing advocacy work, just to change the landscape on access to justice and for low income people. So it's really been a very interesting sort of legal career and a mix of experiences. And I think part of that too for me is I've had the privilege of chairing and serving on a number of boards after the past 25 years, including a national board and a bunch of provincial boards, some in law, some like the Law Commission and the Law Foundation, which I'm a trustee at now, some in the settlement sector, and some in shelter and violence work. And also on the side, I'm a mom. I have two very moody teenagers, and my mom and sister live with me. And I'm surprised my partner, my husband, hasn't left because he's in this house with all of us. And yeah, it's the best of times and sometimes the worst of times.
Are they two girls?
An older son and a daughter, but the two of them are a team, lockstep, a team in thinking that we are humiliating them at all times, right? And if they were here, they would tell me to be like 6, 7, but and there, I just did it. I did it if they watch
There you
it.
go. I mean, my son always points that up there too. Now, one of the things you didn't mention there is I know you've obviously been a bencher for the Law Society now for a number of years, and you are up for running for treasurer. So why are you running for treasurer?
Yeah, you know what's so interesting about it? It's the same reason I ran to be a bencher, right? I care really deeply about the Law Society's kind of core responsibilities, protecting the public. And I won't come as a surprise to people because I've worked with so many people in the public and our system does. That's first kind of forefront for me and regulating in the public interest. So I work in a really small space, right? And I think the most of our licensees work in small spaces, work as sole practitioners, and that regulation has to land on people in a way that it will allow them to practice in the public interest, right? At the end, with the people I would love for people to practice with. And so it really matters to me, and I've lived it, right? I live in a place where those fees matter to our ability and our capacity to provide service. Regulation is good. It matters to us to support us, right, in terms of what we can do. And the other piece is that I made a choice right from the beginning around the advancement of access to justice and issues like equity across the board. So not just race equity, but disability equity, gender equity, equity in terms of practice, equity between paralegals and lawyers. All of it matters to me in that bigger picture around advancing access to justice. And that's sort of one of the reasons that I think the Law Society has a special role and can play actually a meaningful role there. And that's something that with my skill set, I could push forward as well.
Perfect. So, I mean, there's certainly been a number of changes over the last 3 years. I mean, feel free to pick whichever one, or I'm sure if you could pick maybe a couple of them if you could squeeze it in. But what are some of the changes that you could highlight and share your thoughts and why?
Yeah, I think there are two that I want to talk about. One, which a lot of people will have seen a recent announcement about, right? Governance reform. And we're a cohort of 54 people in an elected sort of board of directors, what we call ourselves benchers. And it's large. And I'm really, really so happy that we actually, in our committee, our governance committee, did such incredible hard work on this and brought it back to convocation. And we've made a decision, right, to try and reduce the size. And so I think that's key. We've made a decision. So that decision, though, doesn't fall only within our hands. It's something that we have to work with government to make sure happens. So I think one of the significant changes is that we got there and that we have to now work with government to get us there. I think doing it will help us along the way with what we even talked about when we were running, which is sort of that efficiency, that accountability, and that transparency piece. So all of those words have been tied into the idea of governance reform. I know they feel like words, right? When we say them, like if I say that to the public, they'll be like, okay, what does it mean, right? But truly, I think convocation and the benchers have played a pretty big role in making those three things critically important. And you'll hear that from almost all of the benchers that you speak to, that that's where we want to get to. So I think that's one of the most significant changes to really think about the modernization and bringing down that convocation size to the end of being to regulate better, right, for the public and the profession. But the other thing that I will also talk about is the announcement that was made around Indigenous cultural training, right? And the fact that we are now going to ask licensees and paralegals to take that training in keeping with our call to action under TRC, which was 27. And so I think one of the significant changes that we have to tackle with is making sure actually that the training lands on licensees in a way that it's manageable. It gives them competencies that they didn't have that actually will relate to their practice. And believe me, I've taken it. Many things in there will relate to any number of areas of law, and making sure that we create the environment that they can take it and that it doesn't become onerous in addition to the busy and difficult lives we're already all leading.
Now, with all of those changes, and the next thing is obviously if you are elected to be the treasurer, and I've been told, from earlier today that it comes pretty fast and furiously. I mean, within like a week, you're chairing your first convocation. So, what's the first thing you would do in your first 100 days as treasurer?
I mean, it's interesting because 100 days as treasurer is like almost, I think, if you math it out, it's a quarter of the term, right? Like already. And so I think you have to be realistic. When you're in a scenario where you're kind of electing these positions for 1 year, you have to be realistic. Of course, we want to have some continuity in that role, but we're coming up to an election. And so we have to think about that, right? And so we have to be realistic around what we're doing. So in my first 100 days, I think the first thing is really to sit down and think about all of the work underway. I just talked to you about some of it, but there is other stuff that's going on underway in terms of things like looking at our tribunals and modernizing them and the reform there, and thinking about one space in particular where we really have to have a very meaningful but quick conversation, which is around the regulation of tech, right? So we already know that there are a number of legal products out there, and we also have AI now in the mix. And what is our responsibility towards moving the conversation? In my day job in that work, we have that conversation with governments who we feel like are going too slow. So as a regulator, I think that's really critical in the first 100 days. So really, I think I would focus on moving through the next steps for that governance reform. Also, one of the critical things for a board, and in particular its chair, is making sure that we are giving the right direction to our CEO. Right? We've had a lot of internal organizational change. We have a relatively new CEO, and to create organizational stability, that connection between the treasurer and the CEO and giving clear governance direction so the CEO can do their job to make sure those things happen operationally is important. It sounds boring, but I think because I've chaired a lot of boards, those are really actually at the minutia, really critical and important things. And then the other piece is that I do want to think about the Law Society's role in access to justice. They do really great forward-facing work. There's a really great report that has come out of the Access to Justice Committee with clear steps, and really thinking about what can I do with my own unique connections in that role to help operationalize that and actually push the needle, right, around what can the Law Society do with other justice sector actors and actresses and people to make sure that we push access to justice, not just talk about it, but push it. Because I think a lot of us who practice are seeing what is happening, right? And not just at the low income level, but really people above that who actually don't qualify for even legal aid services, but really are stuck. And so I think that's really critical. So I think we're talking about stability operationally and working with the CEO, getting through our governance reforms, and then landing those other pieces like the competence, like the professional development pieces, like the tribunal reform, and like looking at the technology piece.
So kind of related to that, I mean, is the actual role of the treasurer, and what qualities do you believe are most important in being effective as a treasurer, and how do those qualities align with your own leadership style?
So I think anyone who's treasurer needs a combination of skills, right? Sound judgment. And sometimes that also means not being quick to rush to what to do, even though you will be pressured to. But as a chair, you have to have some sound judgment, which also means thinking about looking at who's around the table and who can guide you and provide their opinions and expert opinions. You need to have credibility, right? So you need to be genuine and credible. I think transparency is a key piece. So I work in a space already where transparency is fundamental to the work that we do. We answer to public funders, we answer to our members, but most of all, we answer to the communities that we serve. And so I think it's really important that we create that kind of structural environment. I think financial discipline. So at its core, I think one of the critical functions of a board is financial oversight. Right. So I sit on the Law Society's Audit and Finance Committee. I do that for the work that I do outside, and I've done that on a number of boards that I've sat on. And I think that's a really key piece. It's not to say any treasurer will actually know all the ins and outs of understanding financials, but has to understand that that's a really critical piece of oversight. And I think the other piece is being in spaces and working with people who don't always agree with you, which is fine. Right. I've lived my entire career in spaces where lots of people don't agree with me. But that doesn't mean we can't work together. And it doesn't mean that we've gotten amazing things done together. And so those are some of those skill sets, right? And then I think what is also really critically important for a treasurer is being able to speak to our core mandate, meaning that we are able to connect with the public, actually get out there and connect. We are able to connect with our licensees who we are meant to regulate, right? And if there is no connection, we lose credibility with both the public and our licensees. So I think that's a really important thing, a really important skill set for the treasurer.
Well, I mean, you alluded to this, but again, I mean, one of the responsibilities is leading convocation where you have benchers with differing views. Now, you've talked about some changes where the votes were pretty split. So, how do you build consensus while still moving those initiatives forward, especially in an election year?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a live question, right? So I think one thing is consensus doesn't mean unanimity to me, right? It never will be, but it does mean to me that people will understand the issue, right? And have all the information they need, the stuff that I think is important and the stuff that I wish they didn't have but should have, right? And then they feel heard, that people get a chance to feel heard and are not shut down. So that if they trust the process, then at least we have a decision-making process where we'll get to a decision, we'll get to a scenario most of the time in my experience where there is general consensus. And those who don't feel like they agree with the decision being made will still have been satisfied, at least with the process, right? And I've been on the receiving end of that in a lot of work where I haven't gotten the decision I wanted, but I still felt like I was heard, I was valued, and I had bought into the process. And so that's, I think, how you build consensus. I also think you build consensus actually by those connections with people. So not just coming into a room and presenting something, but actually talking to people and hearing. And to be honest, in the work even that I've done at the Law Society, I've changed my mind. I've heard from people who know more than I do about a particular thing, and they've thought about it in a different way, and it's made me change my mind. And so I think if we have ventures coming in with that mindset, and I think by and large we do, there's a large group of people who come in with that mindset of thinking about things. If we structure it in a way where we're giving them the information, allowing people to connect and talk about and be heard, I think we can get to consensus on most things. And listen, we're going to have things that are contentious, and that's also okay. Right. I think that that's the nature of the work that we do. And we're lawyers and paralegals. Many of us work in spaces, especially our litigators, where things are always contentious, right? And so we're used to those environments. And I've spent a long time in my career sitting in rooms with people who just don't agree with me. And through talking through processes and talking through things, we've moved needles together. And some of the people who I would never have thought would be the champions of some of the things I've talked about have been, like in the violence space, have been allies. And so that idea that you can't reach consensus because of differing views has not held up, right, in the work I've done.
So, kind of on that, then is there's a certainly great challenges that are currently facing the law society, as well as great opportunities. You mentioned AI as well before. So, what do you think is the greatest opportunity for the law society and the greatest challenges that they're facing?
Yeah, I think like as we stand, I think the greatest opportunity is that we are talking about the idea of making regulation more practical, modernizing, and connecting it to the realities of practice for lawyers and also the realities of life for the different parts of the public, right, that we talk about. Um, and the strength is, I think there's an alignment there, actually. Even amongst differing views, there's an alignment on that idea of being pragmatic and looking at the realities for the public and the practice. And so the greatest strength is actually that alignment and really focusing on what we can get done together to get there. And I think if we do get there, some of the things I talked about, like access to justice, flow from that. Right. And so I think that's a really great piece. And so I think the biggest challenge is credibility, right? We don't have to pretend that we've gone through a number of years now where we've really challenged our own credibility with some of the things that have happened at the organization and at Convocation. And so the challenge around credibility is also about what I kind of said earlier around um, making things more transparent, being able to communicate with our public, not just by bulletins, but actual connection with the public and with licensees about what's going on at the regulator. Sometimes when I talk to my own clients, the feeling that they give me is that they just think our regulator is there to protect lawyers and paralegals, right? Um, and so really being able to communicate what we are doing on access to justice, what we are doing on AI and those products to make sure that the public is protected. Because in those spaces, it's actually the public, from what I'm seeing in my work, that are bearing the brunt of the wrong information that they're getting through those sort of things. So what can we do to make it better for public use? What can we do in those spaces? And what can we do for our licensees so they feel comfortable moving into, an environment where we're going to be using those kinds of things. So I think credibility is the big challenge, right? And I also think, that our governments need to feel comfortable that we can regulate effectively. And so by demonstrating this through the work we're doing, I think we're getting there. So the opportunity is that we're getting there. The challenge, though, is that we need to communicate it out better and restore and sort of build that credibility.
Now, with that, I mean, often, you see the treasurer as the face of the Law Society, and regardless of what's happening with the Law Society, and whether it's with staff, whether it's with certain ventures, whether it's the collection or the decisions that was made, it often, the treasurer is the person that's going to be sort of owning up to what's happening. So, how would you strengthen engagement between the Law Society, its licensees, and the public, given that sort of role?
Yeah, I think that's a challenging piece, right? And I thought about it a lot when I was going to run because I run a clinic. And so what I thought in that what part of why I want to run is I think that a treasurer could strengthen it by getting out there, actually speaking with people. So I'll take some of the paralegal consultations that have been going on with the help of people from the Paralegal Standing Committee and now thinking about sort of future vision is that we actually just spent the time and talked to hundreds and hundreds of people in a consultation, right? And there was such value in actually connecting with organizations, connecting with different parts of the bar, connecting with paralegals, and connecting with the users, right, of those services, the public, around thinking about how to do that. It's a huge undertaking of time. I'm definitely going to be taking a very large leave from the work that I do because I think one of the things is we need to get out there. I work actually in remote and rural spaces in the province. The practices and the realities for both licensees and the public is so different. And we can talk about graying of the barn, we can see it in a written consultation, but it is a very different thing when you sit down and talk to people. There are people from the Equity and Indigenous Affairs Committee who were able to go out to Thunder Bay and actually talk to people. And it was a crystallization of really hearing what is going on, right? And so that is, I think, the forward-facing role, right? I'm the person who runs an organization. I have that role. I have that forward-facing role of actually connecting to figure out whether what we think we're doing is on track for who we are wanting to do it for, right? Which is the public and our licensees in this case. So I think a treasurer who is connected to organizations, who takes the time. And the other thing, JP, honestly, is that also connected to our younger cohort, students who are not licensees and newer licensees, right? So that we can also bring some optimism. It feels like a scary time, I think, for a lot of people in law who are practicing and for the public in terms of access to justice. And there's a role to play, right, in going out there and bringing that optimism around, at least for the regulator, we are thinking about these things.
Now, if you're elected, where would you like to see the Law Society 1 year from now? And certainly 1 year from now, as someone pointed out to me, you may not even be uh, coming back as an elected venture, right? To sort of really underscore the quote unquote lame duck, you may not be elected at that
Yeah.
time. But what do you think, you'd like to see the Law Society be at, and what would be most important to achieving that vision?
Okay, so really short statement. I want to see it more stable. I want to see it more focused, more transitioned, and I want to see it better positioned for the next bench, whoever is coming in, right? So if we talk about governance reform and reducing size, we should be also doing some work that prepares us for what a smaller convocation looks like, right? So that we are not leaving that to our new cohort of benchers who will then be bogged down in trying to figure that out all on their own, right? So it is succession planning in a sense. So that piece, right? I want to be able to at least see our licensees and public starting to feel like they have a better connection to us, right? And understanding how our decisions are made around our mandate towards all of them, right? Around access to justice, around protecting the public, and around regulating our licensees in a way where they can actually practice, right? And do those things themselves. So, I don't want to, I'm not focused on sort of lowering our expectations. What I am focused on is really thinking about that responsible government governance, right? So I think being honest about what we can complete, what needs development, and what should be left for our bench, that we actually have that plan in place and that succession because we are going into an election, right?
And finally, what would you like the benchers who are able to cast a vote starting this Wednesday? What would you like them to know most about your candidacy when they're at the poll or the electronic poll? I'm presuming.
Electronic poll. When they're sitting in their offices or their home offices voting, yes. So part of also why I ran is that my experience really fits this moment, right? I'm at a point in my career with a significant level of experience. I bring governance experience, financial oversight experience, government relations experience, practice experience in multiple areas of law, geographic experience in terms of where I've worked. I run a small firm setting, and I've worked for 25 years with the public. So my experience sort of fits the moment, right? And I'm running for that reason. This is a practical role at a practical time, and I bring that practical experience. I also really do want people to remember that I care deeply about the public interest. I care deeply about access to justice. I want the law society to be focused, transparent, financially disciplined, and practical. I want regulation that protects the public and also understands the realities of practice. I live in both of those spaces. But I also want people to remember that we can be optimistic. I'm actually a very optimistic person. I've seen what that work can do to move the needle and how that has a straight line to the people we work with in the public, right? And I do think that this is a group that if we focus, we can do some really great and important things even in that 1 year.
Perfect. So, Shalini, thank you so much for taking the time to join me and to share about your candidacy. Again, I wish you all the best of luck, and whichever one of the four of you happens to be elected, I'm hoping that we can follow up maybe a couple months down the road and see how things are going, and happy to share any information about the Law Society with anyone listening. So, thanks again, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. Take care.
Thank you so much.